The last night of December came to the Kenyan savannah, the way it always does, not with fanfare, but with a deepening quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over grassland when the heat finally releases its hold and the stars press closer to the earth. She was lying on her side in the long, dry grass, a cow of perhaps 30 years, her skin the color of old bark, her flanks barely moving. There were no wounds. No predators had come. The ground around her was undisturbed. That year's dry season had run 3 weeks longer than any the rangers had recorded in the last decade, stretching past every calculation, burning the grass to pale straw and shrinking the water sources to brackish pockets in cracked mud. A nursing mother needs more than she can find in ground like that. And so a body under that kind of pressure does. What bodies do begins to spend what it has saved, converting its own reserves into milk, feeding the calf even as it feeds itself less and less. When there was nothing left to spend, she lay down. Beside her, shifting her weight from one small foot to the other, a 6-month-old calf pressed her forehead against her mother's shoulder. She pushed gently the way calves do when they want a mother to rise. The shoulder did not move. She pushed again. The grass bent in a dry wind coming off the plain. And the calf, her name would later be written in a ranger's log as Amara, a name meaning grace, in Swahili, stood in the blue-black African night and waited for something she did not yet have the knowledge to stop waiting for. A calf orphaned at 6 months carries stress hormones that climb and do not fall on their own. And the immune system, suppressed by that sustained chemical weight, begins to fail slowly, leaving no mark on the outside until it is already too late. She would not die quickly. That is what made it urgent. The ranger who found them was on a night patrol, moving with his headlamp low along the eastern fence line, and he almost walked past the cow. It was so still, so perfectly still, that for a moment the shape of her in the grass looked like a boulder. Then the calf turned her head toward the light, and he stopped. The call went out to Joseph Kamau's radio at the kind of hour when sleep sits heaviest, and he was on his feet before he was fully awake, pulling on his boots. In the dark of the warden's station, the familiar weight of the drive ahead settling over him, like a coat he had worn so many times it had taken the shape of his shoulders. He had been doing this for 22 years. The jacket he wore that night had faded at both elbows in the particular way that happens when a person has spent years leaning against the metal walls of truck beds waiting. He had seen this before. That did not make it easier to see. By the time the truck reached them, the calf had not moved far from her mother's body, maybe 3 meters, maybe less. The reluctance in every step, visible even in the sweep of the headlights. The rangers spread out without speaking, each taking a position they had learned through repetition, forming a loose perimeter that was not a trap, but a shape, a gentle narrowing of the available world. The first time they approached Amara, bolted sideways toward the body, and pressed herself against her mother's back, her small flank heaving. They stopped. They waited. After a time, she turned and looked at them again, her ears wide, her weight rocking forward and back in the way of an animal considering a decision it does not yet understand it is making. The second approach, she let them come closer before she moved not back toward the body this time, but sideways, skirting the edge of the headlight's reach, testing the dark at the perimeter. One of the rangers took a slow step to the left, and she stopped. And they were all still together in the warm night, the grass moving around them in a low wind that smelled of dust and dry acacia. The third time they came in, tighter, and she moved again toward the body, pressing her forehead once more against the shoulder that would not respond. And a sound came from her, low and formless. The kind of sound that has no name in any field manual. Joseph stood near the truck and watched, and did not move toward her. There were 8 more approaches before she came. Not 8 dramatic moments, 8 quiet incremental renegotiations of distance, each one slightly different from the last, until at some point in the 40th minute, Amara simply walked to the ramp at the truck's rear and stood at the bottom of it, and no one had been able to say afterward what finally changed, only that it had. Once she was in the cargo bed, she folded herself down onto the floor and began to shake. The trembling was not cold. The night was warm. It was the kind of shaking that happens when a nervous system is doing the only thing available to it. Joseph climbed in after her and pulled the cargo door down behind him, and the truck began to move. The drive to Nairobi takes 6 hours on a good road, and that night the road was good, and still it was 6 hours. He did not try to soothe her with his hands. Touching too early can alarm a calf who has not yet learned to trust the smell of humans, and he knew this. And so he sat with his back against the truck wall and his hands resting open in his lap, simply present in the only way available to him. In the first hour, Amara did not look at him. She faced the rear of the truck, her eyes toward the dark seam of the door, as though she were still calculating whether the distance back was crossable. The shaking moved through her in waves, her shoulders, then her flanks, then the whole length of her small body. And between waves there were brief intervals of stillness that were not calm, but exhaustion. Somewhere in the second hour, the intervals began to lengthen. Not because anything had changed, but because there is a limit to how long a body can sustain that level of alarm, and hers had found it. Her breathing deepened. Her head dropped slightly. She was not calm. She was spent. Outside the truck's small windows, the new year was arriving over Nairobi in cascading light, the distant bloom and crack of fireworks rising above the city's edge. Celebrations that had been planned for months unfolding precisely on schedule, indifferent and bright. A city marking the passage of time in the only way cities know how. Inside the truck, the engine and the sound of Amara and Joseph sitting against the wall with his hands in his lap and his jacket faded at both elbows, watching her breathe. Around the third hour, she slept for a few minutes, not deeply, just a brief collapse into unconsciousness that lasted perhaps 4 minutes before some sound from the road surface or some shift in the truck's movement brought her back, her head lifting, her eyes open, and scanning the panic returning for a moment before it settled again. This happened 3 times before Nairobi began to appear at the horizon. A low orange glow against the underside of the clouds, a warmth in the sky that had nothing to do with dawn. In the 4th hour, she turned for the first time, so that she was no longer facing the rear of the truck. She did not face him. She faced sideways, her body angled so that he was somewhere in her peripheral vision, present, but not direct observable, without requiring a response. He did not change his position. He did not acknowledge the turn. He had learned across 22 years and more drives than he could count that the worst thing you can do when an animal offers you a fragment of trust is to move toward it too quickly to close the distance before the distance is ready to be closed. So he stayed where he was, back against the wall, hands in his lap, and the truck moved through the dark and outside the windows. The Kenyan night gave way in slow degrees to the orange glow of the city, and Amara stood sideways in the cargo bed and breathed, and Joseph sat still and breathed, and the distance between them held at exactly what it was. She did not stop shaking for the first 3 hours. He did not stop sitting with her. The David Sheldrick Wildlife Trust's nursery on the edge of Nairobi National Park operates on rhythms built across decades, and the morning Amara arrived, those rhythms adjusted to receive her the way a river adjusts around a new stone. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, practical intelligence of a system that has learned through long experience that the most important thing it can offer a newly orphaned calf is not excitement, but continuity. She was given formula milk in a bottle, the precise mixture calibrated by years of trial and loss. The fat content and protein ratio adjusted for a calf of her age and her likely nutritional history, and she drank it. That was noted. That was the one good sign in the first day. The herd came to her that first afternoon. They were a small group of older orphans, some of them 18 months into their rehabilitation. Some closer to 2 years, their coats filled out. Now their movements carrying the particular assurance of animals who have over long and uneven months begun to understand that this place is safe. And they came along her fence line without being directed, without any keeper prompting them. Because this is what elephant herds do when something new and small arrives. The largest of them reached the fence first. She was perhaps 3 years old, her skin a dark gray-brown, a small notch in her left ear from something that had happened before she arrived here and that no one had been able to fully document. She did not reach her trunk through the fence immediately. She stood at a distance of perhaps half a meter from the wire and simply let her presence be felt. Her smell moving ahead of her the way it always does, carrying information that no human observer could read, the slow chemical language of elephants that precedes every other form of communication they have. After some time, she stepped closer. Her trunk extended through one of the fence's lower gaps, not quickly, but in that characteristic unhurried way, feeling the air on the other side moving in a slow arc that covered the ground between them without touching anything. One by one, the others arrived behind her, spreading along the fence in a loose line, each of them conducting their own version of this investigation. Some reaching through, some simply standing, one younger calf pressing the side of its face against the wire and staying there as though listening. Amara from the far corner watched all of this. Her two front feet were close together, her weight slightly back, her ears held neither wide nor flat, but somewhere in between, not full alarm, but not ease, either the posture of an animal that is processing more information than it can act on. The distance between her corner and the nearest fence post was approximately 8 meters. She did not cross it. The herd stayed at the fence for a long time that afternoon, longer than the keepers had noted in their records for most new arrivals, and when they finally moved away, it was gradual. Not a group departure, but a slow drift, one by one back toward their own enclosure and the evening feeding. And even then, the large female with the notched ear paused once and turned back toward Amara's fence before continuing on. Amara watched her go. She ate her formula when the bottle came. She drank. She did not move from the corner for the rest of that day. A keeper named Mwangi had the evening shift that first week, and on the third night, he stood at the window of the observation post long after his notes were finished and watched Amara in the blue dark of the enclosure, while the rest of the herd settled into sleep 30 meters away. Elephant sleep is a particular thing to observe, the way they arrange themselves against each other, trunk draped over the back of the animal beside them. Weight distributed, breathing becoming gradually synchronized until the whole group is rising and falling at nearly the same interval, a single slow rhythm made of many bodies. Amara stood in the far end of her enclosure and watched this from across the distance between them. Her ears moved. From the park beyond the nursery's outer fence came the ordinary sounds of a Nairobi night, the distant bark of a zebra, the sustained note of insects in the acacia trees, once a sound that might have been a hyena far off in the middle distance. She turned toward each of these sounds as they came, and then returned her gaze to the sleeping herd. She did not lie down. Mwangi stayed at the window until close to midnight. He did not write this in the log because there was no category in the log for it. He went home. At the end of the second week, Joseph reviewed the cortisol results from Amara's fecal samples, a measurement that offers the cleanest available window into what a calf's body is doing underneath its observable behavior, translating interior stress into a number that can be compared tracked set against a baseline. The numbers had not come down. He set the papers on his desk without squaring their edges, just set them down and stood and walked out to the fence line of Amara's enclosure. She was finishing her mid-morning bottle held by one of the younger keepers. Her trunk curled around it in the slightly possessive way she had developed in the past few days, as though she had learned that the bottle would not be taken from her, but was not yet entirely certain. Joseph stood at the fence and watched her drink. The shadow of the fence post fell across the ground at his feet and moved slightly as the morning shifted. He stood there until the bottle was empty and the keeper had stepped back and Amara had turned to face the far end of the enclosure again, resuming her default orientation, body angled toward the corner. Eyes on the middle distance, the same 8 meters of space between herself and everything else. Then he walked back inside. The herd came to her fence each morning and each afternoon. The large female with the notched ear came every time. Amara watched from the corner every time, and the days accumulated in the way that days do when you are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. The formula bottles arriving and being emptied. The grass in the enclosure being cropped and recovering the cortisol numbers, arriving at the end of each week and sitting on the desk. In papers that did not move until Joseph moved them, and the distance between Amara's corner and the fence line remaining 8 meters, then 8 meters, then 8 meters again. No one saw it happen. That is perhaps the most important thing about this story, not the outcome, but the fact that no one witnessed the moment it changed, that it occurred in the unmarked middle of a night that looked like every other night in its first hour and its last hour, and only announced itself in the morning when the keeper came through the door. It was somewhere in the 3rd or 4th week. The keeper on the early shift was a man named Ochieng, who had worked the nursery for 6 years and had learned in that time to read the enclosure before he entered it, to stand at the door for a moment and take in the arrangement of bodies and the quality of the quiet before deciding how to move. He had the formula bottle in his left hand and his keys in his right. And he pushed the door open with his shoulder the way he always did, and he stood at the threshold. The grass in the enclosure held the cool of early morning, that brief damp window, before the sun burns it off, and the light was the pale gold of a Nairobi dawn, coming in low through the fever trees at the park's edge, filling the enclosure with a kind of light that has texture to it, that makes shadows soft rather than sharp. The older calves were waking slowly, shifting weight from foot to foot, reaching toward each other with their trunks in the half-conscious way of animals surfacing from deep rest, their eyes still carrying the opacity of recent sleep. And there in the middle of that cluster, not at the edge, not at the 3-meter remove, where Amara had stood every night for weeks, but genuinely in the middle, folded against the flank of the large female with the notched ear, Amara lay with her breathing slow and her body entirely still, in the way that means rest rather than grief. The female had one leg extended toward her. Just that. One leg shifted in sleep, an unconscious adjustment of weight that had created a space against her body. And Amara was in that space, her head low, her breathing the deep and regular breathing of an animal that has finally, after many nights, stopped listening for something that will not come. Ochieng set the formula bottle down on the ground at the threshold, set it down slowly, without sound, and he did not enter. He pulled the door back to where it had been just short of closed, and he walked across the yard to find Joseph. In the minutes between, while the yard was still quiet and the morning was still early and no one was yet in the enclosure, the herd continued to wake at its own pace, and Amara continued to sleep, and the light continued to move through the fever trees in the way that light does when there is nothing to stop it. Joseph was at his desk when Ochieng came to the door. He listened to what Ochieng said without interrupting, and then he stood and followed him across the yard, and he stood at the enclosure door and looked at what was there to look at. An elephant herd makes its decisions about who belongs through scent and proximity, and some interior reckoning that operates in the hours when no one is watching, in the press of one body against another, in the dark, in the small adjustments that sleeping animals make, without waking in ways that leave no record a field manual could hold. They had decided, not when the staff watched, not when the introduction was formally conducted. In the night, in their own time, for their own reasons, in a way that left no record except this: a small calf sleeping where she had not slept before against a body that had extended one leg toward her in the dark without knowing it was doing anything at all. Joseph took out his phone. He raised it carefully, his elbow against the door frame to keep the frame steady, and took one photograph. Amara's small dark shape nested against the larger one, the enclosure holding the morning light around them. The notched ear of the older female visible above Amara's back, one leg still extended in its unconscious gesture of inclusion. He stood there for a time after that. The morning continued around him, birds moving through the fever trees at the outer fence, the sound of the other keepers beginning their rounds. On the far side of the nursery, the smell of the park coming in warm and dry off the grass as the dew began to lift. He put the phone in his pocket. He pulled the enclosure door gently to and walked back across the yard. Some days after that, not many Mwangi was on the evening shift and stood again at the observation window at the hour when the herd settled into sleep. He had made a habit of this, though he had not named it a habit. The herd arranged themselves the way they always did, trunks and flanks and the slow synchronization of breath. Amara was not in the far corner. She was not quite in the center of the group either. She stood perhaps 1.5 meters from the nearest of them, her body angled not away, but parallel, facing the same direction as the others, her ears no longer scanning the park sounds the way they had in the first weeks, but resting soft against her neck. She was not in the group, but she was no longer outside it. When the large female lay down, and the others began to follow, Amara stayed where she was, for a time standing, and then she lowered herself to the ground at that distance of 1.5 meters, and her breathing slowed, and the enclosure went quiet around her. Mwangi wrote one line in the log that night, center left of enclosure standing, then grounded 21:15. Joseph read it the next morning. He did not say anything to anyone. He took out his phone and looked at the photograph he had taken at the door, Amara's small shape against the older female's flank. The pale gold morning light, the one extended leg, and then he put the phone back in his pocket and went to where the day's work was waiting. The enclosure was loud with the sounds of the morning feeding. When he crossed the yard, the low vocalizations of calves who had learned that the formula bottles came at this hour, the particular scuffling of hooves on packed earth. Oh Cheng's voice somewhere on the other side of the fence saying something to one of the younger keepers in a tone that meant everything was ordinary and fine. Amara was at the fence when Joseph passed. Not at the far corner at the fence, near enough to the gate that he could have reached through and touched her if he had wanted to, which he did not, because she was not looking at him. And that was not the point. She was looking past him toward the yard, her trunk moving slowly along the lower wire of the fence in the curious exploratory way that means an animal is attending to the world rather than fleeing it. He kept walking. She kept looking. The morning kept going as mornings do, indifferent to the small distances that had shifted in the night, and the nights before the 8 meters that had become 7, and then 5, and then 1.5 meters. And then in the dark, nothing at all carrying forward in its ordinary way. Everything that had already been decided by the animals, who had always known how to do this without being shown. The formula intake records moved in the weeks that followed. The weight logs shifted. The behavioral notes that Mwangi and Ocheng and the other keepers added each evening accumulated into a shape that the numbers alone could not have drawn Amara at the fence. Instead of the corner Amara at 1.5 meters instead of 8. Amara grounded at 21:15. Within reach of warmth, she had not chosen, and then one night chosen. Joseph filed the weekly reports. The way he always had the data entered in the same columns. It had always occupied everything formatted in the language that the work requires. He did not write down the photograph. There is no column for photographs. There is no column for the quality of the morning light in the fever trees, or for the sound of a calf's breathing when it has finally stopped being vigilant, or for the particular stillness of a man standing at an enclosure door long enough that his shadow moves on the ground at his feet without him noticing. These things exist in the record only as their downstream effects. Numbers moving in one direction rather than another. Notations shifting over weeks from one side of the page to the other, and the record is accurate as far as it goes, which is not all the way. Joseph knew this. He had known it for 22 years. He kept the records anyway, because the records were what he could give, and because the photograph was already somewhere else in his pocket. Carried out of the enclosure on a morning in early January when the year was still new and Amara was still sleeping. And the world outside the nursery's fence was already moving on to whatever came next, as it always does, as it always will, without pausing to mark the things that happened in the dark.